Then the second thing to think about is what kind of types and examples of scenarios there are. We remember from the lecture 1 that there are possible, probable and preferred futures. There are also, they can be reflected to scenarios. All scenarios should be possible, but only a few of these possible scenarios are probable or preferred futures. A scenario process can be constructed first as a set of very different alternative scenarios, and only after the scenarios are constructed, we can start evaluating their probability and desirability. Or you can also, if you like, start from the very beginning to aim for preferred scenarios. Ted Gordon and Jerome Glenn from the Millennium Project, they even claim that no scenario is ever seen as probable. Actually, it's a criteria of a good scenario that it is not probable. Why? It is, the reason is that if we make scenarios on a possible basis, we get more alternatives, and it's more wider, the set of scenarios, and we don't miss some very important elements. So, scenario is not a single method, but it is probably the most frequently used technique in future studies and definitely the best known. But what it is then if it's not a single method? It can be described as a mindset. It is really, you need to have a certain way of thinking when you start doing scenarios. It is an approach, it is a toolbox full of various techniques and processes. There is also the concept of image of the future in future studies. Scenarios differ from images of the future in their structure because scenarios, as I mentioned, must always include a path to their end state, whereas images of the future, they may remain as still cross-cut descriptions of a future state or world. They are also very useful, but the difference is that they don't necessarily have this kind of path. Scenarios and images of the future resemble each other. The nature of scenario storylines and narratives is threefold, just as in case of images of the future, these possible, probable, and preferred futures. And it is important to remember that other foresight methods are used in connection with scenario building. As I mentioned, futures workshops, futures table, Delphi weak signal analysis, pioneer analysis. What kind of categories are there in scenarios then? We can divide actually all scenarios in two categories. Scenarios are explorative or normative. Explorative scenarios, they aim at exploring, probing future worlds, making manuscripts for their unfolding as openly as possible. So they are descriptive narrative of what might happen. Normative scenarios, on the other hand, they focus on narratives that fit into an expressed goal or mission. They are plausible narratives of what is hoped for. You remember this Wendell Bell's idea that one of the specific purposes of future studies is advocate a certain future, a preferred future. So they fall into the category of normative scenarios if you are making a scenario fitting an expressed goal or mission. You can also divide scenarios in quantitative scenarios or qualitative scenarios. The ideal case is actually to combine both. So very often they are combinations of these both. Examples of scenarios that exist, very famous examples are given by Shell company around 50 years they have been doing scenarios on a regular basis. The most recent one is called Mountains and Oceans. I mentioned that the number 2 for scenarios is not very recommended because it tends to become black and white, but it is used here we see an example of 2 scenarios as a set of scenarios. It's called new lens scenarios. New lens scenarios, they present 2 possible ways that this century could unfold with dramatically different implications for society and the world's energy system. And they are thinking what might lie ahead in 50 years' time from now, or even in 2100 and more. So number of pressing global trends and issues are used as lenses through which company representatives can view the world. So this is one example of a set of 2 scenarios. A set of 3 scenarios is given by Millennium Project, and they are about the future of work. And what is specific here is that they are not only on the future of work, but on the future of work as intimately connected to technology. And time horizon is for 2050. Global scenarios. First scenario, it's complicated, a mixed bag. This is kind of a combination that artificial intelligence exists, but we cannot really take advantage of it. Some people make a success in working life, but a growing number is dropping out. And the second scenario, political economic turmoil, future despair, is more pessimistic even. So possibilities for developing or utilizing new technologies is lost because in politics and also in economy, short-term horizon is still existing. And the third one is like the pessimistic, optimistic view. If humans were free, a scenario of the self-actualizing economy where a huge number of people are happy, even though they may not have salary work, they have managed to have meaningful activity in society. So this is a set of 3 scenarios. One, like business as usual, this is more pessimistic and this is more optimistic. And what is special here, when these scenarios have been made, the idea, they are global scenarios, but the idea is to run this set of scenarios on national levels. So here you see a list of countries where national workshops have been organized using these scenarios as food for their thoughts for specific national policy making and policy recommendations. And another special type of scenario typology is given by Jim Dater. He says that all scenarios can be one of 4 generic scenario archetypes. Either they represent growth scenario, collapse scenario, disciplined society scenario, or transformational scenario. So all the scenarios that have been made or will be made will fall into one of these categories. So growth very often means pursuit of economic growth, but it can be more general, official view of growth as a preferred future. Second scenario is dystopic collapse scenario, economic collapses and maybe whole society collapses, and it can be a starting point for preventing these kind of developments or thinking how to survive in these kind of collapse scenarios. The third one is disciplined society. This is similar to sustainable development. Trying to control growth, not just look for growth, but in a sustained form, and trying to avoid collapse at the same time. And the last one is the most Different scenario type, it's called transformation, deep, thorough change in society, even change of humans. So that was an example of 4 scenario set. Another type of 4 scenario set was experimental in a recent Tekes-funded near-carbon energy project, where this last scenario type, transformation, was chosen, and then 4 different scenarios were made, but they all represented transformation scenario category. So here you saw that there were several different approaches and types of scenarios that it is worthwhile thinking before scenario making which kind of scenarios you are going to make.